welcome to Sales Psychology 201. Now, if you've been a follower of my podcast, you know I've given a few episodes on the basics of our sales approach, including sales psychology, the cold call openings, the entirety of my sales script. Today, I want to map out the deeper, more complex psychology of sales. So if you have not passed the Sales Psychology 101, just go back, go through the episodes on the sales call cold openers, the 7-stage sales process that we follow. Make sure that you're doing the basics and you feel very comfortable and competent with the basics of our sales approach, because this is going to delve a little bit deeper into this psychology, get a little bit deeper into the subconscious of the sales console. Okay. This is going to show up in-person sales. This is going to show up on the phone. This will even via text message when you're communicating on SMS or emails. This is just the understanding of the buyer psychology. So if you are prepared, let's dive in. So let's start with, it shows up in a lot of parts of the sales call, but specifically in the opening. I've talked about it in other podcasts, but it's very important, and it is what's called a no-based opening question. So again, this is one that you just want to train yourself to flip the script in how you typically ask this question in sales calls or communication. It acts in multiple ways, but really it's when you open a call or when you're asking questions, try to ask questions in a way that elicit, which means to draw out, a no instead of a yes. So instead of saying hey, is now a good time, right? Where the elicitation that you're looking for is a yes. That would be a yes-based question. You want to say, hey, is now a terrible time? Or is now a bad time, right? The elicitation is a no. And the reason it's powerful is twofold. Number one, when people say no, they feel more in control. And that is exactly what you want people to feel when they are buying. You want them to have a sense of what we call perceived control, because you're actually acting as kind of like a puppeteer of this conversation, where you want them to feel fully in control, but they're really walking down the exact path towards buying that you've set, okay? So you want them to feel in control. And there's an empowering feeling when somebody says no. They feel like they're drawing a boundary, right? This is like a psychological connection that's made with the word no and the feeling of saying no. So you are giving them the sense of empowerment when they say no, which is a great thing for them to have. Number two, the more you say that and you flip the way that you ask questions like that, and you elicit more of a no-based question, it actually acts as a pattern interrupt. It's like a tiny little jolt to their thought process that gives you an opening for influence. This comes from the world of hypnotherapy, but pattern interrupts are a very influential and persuasive method of communication. And it shows up in a lot of ways, but this no-based questioning is a really powerful way to do that. And again, it doesn't just have to be the opening. It could be hey, is there any reason that this would be not a good fit for you, right? There's a lot of ways that you can just change the way you ask questions to elicit a no-based question. It's going to show up in a few of the other tips that I'm going to give you, but try to find places that you're asking questions that elicit a yes, and just flip them, reverse them to elicit a no response. Number two is a technique called elicitation. So again, we just talked about eliciting responses. So this is just going to be a standalone tactic, but it's a way to get information without asking for information. And the way you do that is through this technique of elicitation. So let's say, for example, you want to know what somebody paid for personal training at another gym. And you don't want to just ask, because when you ask questions like that, that's a vulnerable piece of information for them to give up. They're going to be kind of defensive about it. That might trigger sales resistance, which is the feeling that they're being sold to, which you don't want. So you would want to use this technique of elicitation by saying something like, oh man, LA Fitness, I heard they just raised their personal training rates to $100 a session. That's crazy, right? And they're gonna have the urge to correct the record by saying something like, "Oh, what? No, I was only paying $70 a session," right? So they just gave you that information, which now you can use because now you've created context into how much they're willing to pay for personal training, or how much they know personal training to cost, without asking like, "How much were you paying for personal training?" So that skill of elicitation is getting information without asking for it. Okay, it's really powerful because when you ask direct questions like that, it could trigger some sales resistance. So the next thing on the topic of sales resistance is building in the habit of asking permission before making statements or asking questions. Okay. People, again, you want to give people the sense of perceived control. And that goes out the window when you start pitching at people, right? So I talk about this in my breakdown of a perfect sales call. But if you just jump in and start talking at people and just being like, "Oh yeah, here's what we do and here's why it's better," sales resistance goes through the roof. But when you ask permission to share information or ask a question that maybe is a little triggers vulnerability or a hard question to ask, it psychologically, they are saying, "Oh, I asked you to tell me this or say this." So there's a cognitive dissonance that happens where they would say, "Why would I get sales resistance when I just gave you permission or I asked you to do that?" So again, build the habit of asking permission very often in the sales call or conversation. So this might sound like, you go through discovery and you're ready to start your pitch and tell them how great you are. And you would say like, "Hey, so it sounds like we might be a good fit. Do you mind if I share how our program works and you'd be able to see if it's a good fit? Would that be okay?" Right? Asking that permission, they're like, "Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Tell me. Right. But if you just like, "Okay, cool. Well, here's what we do and why we're better. And this is the results you're going to get." They're not going to psychologically reduce that sales resistance. Okay. So, the next one is in discovery. Like if you can ask permission to ask hard questions. So, "Hey, you mind if I just ask, like, what was it about us that made you want to reach out versus anybody else?" Okay. It just softens what could trigger a sales resistance. So the more the tone that you have of like concerned curiosity, the more effective you are going to be at sales. Okay. That's going to draw them in versus, you kind of moving towards and jamming stuff down their throat.
Hey guys, just real quick pause. If you're enjoying this, please hit subscribe, like, comment, share this with any fitness professionals that you feel like would benefit from content like this. Let's get back to the episode.
So the next psychology of sales tactic that is one of my absolute favorites is it's called what I call a reversal. There's a lot of different, they call it negative reversals or ways that you can do this. But my favorite way is when somebody's telling you about the last gym that they went to or the last trainer they worked with. And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I was there and I got the best results ever and blah, blah, blah." Then the normal sales person, fitness salesperson, is going to start selling against that. They're going to be like, "Oh yeah, well, we do the same thing, or we get even better results," or they're going to start like comparing us to them. All right. This is going to trigger sales resistance. So for example, if somebody's like, "Oh yeah, my last trainer at LA Fitness was amazing. Like I loved what I was doing," and be like, "Oh yeah, well, we do the same thing and blah, blah, blah." What that's going to trigger them to do is it's going to think of all the ways that they loved their trainer. They're going to be like, "Oh, well, I liked him better." It's this idea of reactance. I'm telling you, if you start pitching and comparing to who you are versus them or trying to say you're better than them, it is the opposite of effective in sales. Okay. The more effective sales method is the reversal, where you kind of step back and you're like, "Wow, like, he sounds really awesome. Like, can I just ask you, like, is there a reason you don't just go back there? I want you to my goal is to help you get the best result. It sounds like you got really good results there. Like, why don't you go back there? Or why don't you stay with that trainer?" What that's going to trigger is them to tell you all the reasons they didn't stay with that trainer, or they can't go back there, or they didn't like it. Because now they're going to be like, "Oh, well, no, like he actually was like way too expensive for me, or he moved away, or he was like making weird comments at me. So I don't want to go back there anymore. Like I came to you." To be like, "Oh, I was just curious because it sounds like you were really happy there." Right. them bragging about their gym that's kind of like a defense mechanism for them in and of itself. They came to you because they weren't happy there, or they're not going back there. If they were all that happy there, they would go back there. But they're sitting in front of you to learn about your gym. So by asking, why do you want to come here? They're just going to trigger the need to talk about why they should go back there. Okay. But if you say, why don't you go back there? Like, hey, I don't know if I wouldn't want to change your routine. I wouldn't want to like change up what worked for you. Like, I can't promise we're going to be as effective. Is there a reason you don't just go back there? Right? Or was there a reason you contacted us if you were really happy there? They will start pouring on the reasons that they came to you versus them. All right. So that's a form of a reversal. That's a really effective sales tactic. So another sales psychology skill is what I call using large language. And it's kind of in the world of the no-based openers, because it falls in a similar category. But it's basically answering things in a very like exaggerated fashion. So where this shows up is, for example, let's say you're talking money, let's say you're talking schedule, you're talking about objections, and you go over the cost, and instead of saying like, oh, like, is that within your budget, right? So first, that's eliciting a yes, which is never what you want to do. The no-based version of that would be like, is that out of your budget, right? So you get 1 point if you say, is that out of your budget versus in your budget? Or is that schedule unrealistic for you versus does that schedule work for you, right? I hope you're following that. But you get 2 points if you use this large language model that sounds like this. So let's say you're talking budget, and you might say like, all right, so this is what it costs, blah, blah, blah. Like, is that completely unreasonable for you? Or is that insanely out of your budget, right? So the reason this is effective is because if you just said, is that out of your budget? There's 2 answers. There's a yes or a no, right? You got a 50-50 shot, right? And a lot of times with a higher ticket fitness service, it's going to be more likely to be out of what they want to pay, right? So they're skewing towards a no. But if you use this large language, like spectrum language, where you say like, is that insanely unrealistic or is that completely out of your budget? Now you've created like yes, no, and it's going to fall somewhere in between here. It's going to be like insanely out of budget. It might be here. Like it's a little out of my budget, not insanely out of not completely ridiculous. So it's a way to just keep the conversation active instead of like a binary response. Like binary responses from them are like dead in the water in sales. So you want to open the door for a spectrum of a response. And I promise you, like this one skill alone, this one tactic will be incredibly effective. When you start getting people to be like, nah, like it's not totally unreasonable. It's a little unreasonable, and be like, okay, well, and then you can take it from there. All right. So using that large language idea is incredibly effective from a sales psychology standpoint. Up next, let's go a little bit deeper into the mind, physically, literally into the brain. There's a work of a neuropsychologist named Antonio Damasio, and he studies the brain. Specifically, he studies people with damage to the frontal cortex in people's brains, specifically in the emotional regulation areas of the brain. I'm blanking on exactly what part of the brain it was, but it was a whole book that was written on it. And basically what he found was he studied people that have damage to a very specific part of their brain that regulated their emotions. And they were functioning 100% fine. They could converse normally. The only time that there was a difference in the way that their cognitive ability was any time it came to making a decision. And what he found in his research was without emotion, it is impossible to make decisions. We are emotional decision makers, not logical. You've probably heard the saying, like, people decide emotionally and justify with logic. So the psychology here is in always moving towards a deeper level of emotional reasoning versus logical, okay? So trying to speak to somebody's like desires and the why behind the reason they want something. So instead of like just if somebody's asking you about like what equipment do you have in the gym, what are the sessions like? What time? How long are the sessions? Those are very like factual surface level things, right? Always just pull back and just be like, oh, like, we typically, our sessions are an hour long, but like, what are you hoping to get from the program? And try to dig just deeper into like the why behind the question or the question behind the question. So the better you can be at like digging into more of an emotional response or getting them into an emotional state, you'll be able to get them to make a decision. If you stay at a logical and like factual or an analytical level, people are going to get stuck. You have to get them into an emotional reasoning state. So the next sales psychology skill is understanding the concept of the pendulum. So this originated in the Sandler sales system. I learned it through my sales mentor, Charlie Houck, with Growth Dynamics. But this pendulum is this concept of the sales decision-making process is like a pendulum. If you're looking at this like a clock, and 3 p.m. is a yes, take my credit card, and the 9 p.m. is no, get the fuck away from me, right? You always, wherever the pendulum is pulled until it crosses that barrier, it's going to swing back the other way. You might be a little convoluted. There's a lot of other stories that go behind this, but the biggest thing is always sell from behind the pendulum. If somebody is pouring on praise and telling you how great the program sounds and how excited they are to start, always like pull back a little bit. Don't say like, awesome, so what do you want to do? You want to sign up, right? That's going to send them the other way. So you always want to do this, call it selling behind the pendulum. Be like, awesome, like, well, what concerns do you still have, right? And then they're going to tell you even more that they like, right? Like, are you sure we covered everything? Are you sure there's nothing else? And I want to make sure that, we're not missing anything. Don't give me too much credit. We haven't done it yet, right? That is the idea of selling behind the pendulum, is never getting ahead of yourself and letting positive words trick you into convincing you've got a sale. It needs to be unequivocal until the credit card has been swiped. You always want to be behind the pendulum. And you do this using language like, are you sure? Right? Are you sure? I don't want to oversell you on this, right? Always be selling kind of on the back foot in a retreating fashion and let people come to you and like convince you that they like, yes, I want to do this now. I want to do this now. Where this typically shows up is, let's say you go through and you talk about the program, you do your pitch, and somebody's like, wow, this like sounds amazing. Like I really am interested. And instead of being like, awesome, so like let's get you signed up, you'd be like, awesome. So like, I don't know, what do you think we should do next? We're like, sounds like you're really interested. Are you sure there's nothing else? Are you sure there's nothing else that you're looking for that we can't do for you? Right? Listen, we don't have all the fancy amenities here. Like, are you sure that this is what you're looking for? When you can get into that frame and that mindset of like that, are you sure language pattern, it's incredibly effective. People are going to be throwing themselves at you, signing up on the spot. And then again, you could even use that from after the sale with reaffirming. They'd be like, listen, my biggest fear is you're going to leave here and regret that you signed up. Is there anything that we didn't cover or any reason that you might not be fully committed or not show up to your first session? And, that's my biggest fear, right? So those are ways that you can get behind the pendulum and not ride this, like get too far ahead of yourself to where it's going to swing the other way. Because the truth is, when people pour praise on you and when people are like showering you with praise and acknowledgement and appreciation for how great it sounds, a lot of times it's because in the back of their mind, they know they're not going to buy. And they're trying to repay you for the time that they wasted. This is like a deeper sales psychology thing that they teach a lot in Sandler, but never accept the praise that's being given to you, because it usually, a lot of times, is people trying to repay you for stealing your time, and they feel a sense of guilt around that, even if they might not consciously understand that. So another sales psychology tip, this is a quick one, is avoiding the word why. So as much as possible, you want to say why without the why. So why can tend to elicit a defensive response, right? Think about all the times you're asked why in your life. It's usually like accusing you of something or in a negative fashion. So instead of asking why, like, why do you want to lose the weight? Or why did you choose us? Right? Just something about it triggers a defensive response, or it can elicit a defensive response. So the better answer is this understanding of the why without the why, is asking like, well, what was it about us that made you want to reach out? Or what's important to you about losing the weight? Or what's important to you about finding the right gym? Or what triggered you to want to work with a personal trainer, right? Exchanging why with what is going to lower that defense mechanism and need for defensiveness. So the last bit of sales psychology, and this one goes a little bit deeper into the subconscious mind, comes from the world of what's called transactional analysis. So this was a field of psychology from, back in the 60s or 70s, with the understanding that people operate from really three different ego states: the adult, the parent, and the child. And the child ego state is where emotional decisions get made, like signing up for a gym. So your goal is to get people into a childlike ego state, and you can do that with language. So you can do that in your discovery by using words like imagine, or let's pretend, or like just humor me for a minute, right? These are ways that you can elicit them to snap into more of like a child ego state, to get them thinking like in a more wondrous fashion about their future and about like what results they can get. Like, imagine you got the best results in the gym. Like, what would that look like? Or let's pretend, you were able to lose the 50 pounds. Like, what do you think you did to achieve that result? Right? That getting people speaking in that way, triggering that child ego state, is incredibly effective for eliciting that child state that leads to emotional reasoning, that leads to making a decision to buy. Right. So I know I just threw a lot at you. There's a lot of like deeper, some nuanced things there with the sales psychology, but the biggest understanding is this: sales is not about being pushy. In fact, the best salespeople are not the Andy Elliott's of the world that are jamming it down your throat and using fear-based coercion. They are the ones that are using persuasion and influence, and they're actually selling from a retreating fashion and pulling people in. The best salespeople and understanding of sales psychology is less about being pushy as it is pulling people towards you and along the journey with you. It's less about confronting people or overcoming objections where you're trying to dominate somebody, as it is sitting side by side on the same side of the table and collaborating on solutions. And when you can understand that it's less about confrontation than collaboration, you will be incredibly effective at sales and persuasion psychology.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you like this content, make sure that you like and subscribe to get more of the content that you want to see about growing your fitness business. You can click any of the videos here to see other episodes, but I want to hear from you. So drop some comments into other content that you would like to see.